Welcome, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. And I hope this series on prayer has been helpful to you. Our country needs a lot of prayer right now. And that's why we've been taking an in-depth look at the model prayer that Jesus gave his disciples as a basic pattern to follow when they came to him and said, teach us how to pray. And for several weeks, we've been digging into that very famous opening phrase of that prayer, Our Father who art in heaven. We talked about how our relationship with our own Father has had such a profound influence on our mental image of our Heavenly Father. And last week we talked about all the different ways that the scripture writers worked hard to find words to describe God's love and compassion. God is described as a lily, a rose, as dew, as wind and fire. God is also even described as a mother bear and a lion. He's also described as different kinds of birds. At one point, Deuteronomy 32 says, God was like an eagle, hovering over its nest, overshadowing its young, then spreading its wings, lifting them in the air and teaching them to fly. He's even pictured as a mother hen. The Gospel of Luke tells us Jesus longed for the people of Jerusalem to turn back to God. And as he was entering the holy city, it was for the final time, he knew he was going there to die. He laments, oh Jerusalem, you kill the prophets and you stone the messengers who were sent to you. How often I wanted to gather in your children as a hen gathers in her chicks under her wings. But you were not willing to come to me. Then last week we talked about some of the feminine metaphors the Bible even uses to reveal God's care and compassion for us. Isaiah 66:13 tells us that God comforts his people like a mother comforts her child. Isaiah 49:15 says God will not forget his children, just like a woman would never forget her nursing child. Hosea 13 verse 8 tells us that God can get as angry as a mother bear robbed of her cubs. But at the same time, God cares for his people like a midwife that cares for a child. Psalm 22:9-10 says, you, Lord, brought me safely through birth and you protected me when I was a baby. And we spent some time last week looking at one of the most unique portrayals of Jesus, or rather of God that Jesus gives us, as a harried housewife. That's the picture that Jesus paints in a short but very powerful parable that he told about a lost coin. Well, today we're going to look at another parable. It's probably his best known parable, the parable of the prodigal son. As one commentary says, we need to broaden our understanding of God the Father, and the best way to relearn what this term Father means as it refers to God is by looking at what Jesus teaches us about his Father in heaven. Perhaps the fullest, most vibrant picture of God's character can be found in Jesus' illustration of the Father in the parable of the prodigal son. In this parable, Jesus outlines the character of God as a father. But Jesus is not describing fathers as they were usually known or observed either in Jesus' day or even in our day, but rather he was creating a new image of a father. So today we're going to take a good look at that wonderful picture that Jesus gives us of a loving, forgiving, we could even say prodigal father. And here's what we mean by that. Let's do a quick review of what that word prodigal means. The word prodigal means spending resources freely and recklessly, even wastefully or extravagantly. It means giving something on a lavish scale. So even though we typically title this parable, and by the way, it's found in Luke 15, verses 11 through 32, if you want to follow along, we call it the prodigal son. A better title might be the story of the prodigal father, or the story of the father's prodigal love. Because Jesus uses this story to teach how God, our Father, is downright extravagant. Some might even say foolish in his love for you and me. Now, a lot of the material that I'm going to be using for this sermon is taken from the writings of Dr. Ken Bailey. He's author of one of my favorite books, The Cross and the Prodigal. Quick background, Bailey was born in Illinois. He was largely raised in the Middle East by missionary parents. Bailey married his wife Ethel before attending Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, where Debbie went to school, taught by Mr. Rogers. The couple went to Egypt, where they began their own missionary work. Bailey spent 40 years living and teaching in seminaries in Egypt, Lebanon, Jerusalem, and Cyprus, while learning Arabic along with absorbing local folk customs and learning common Middle Eastern sayings and proverbs. That's going to be so key to know that, because you see, Bailey studied peasant villages in the Middle East for many, many years, and because their way of life has remained pretty much the same as in Jesus' time, the same dress, many of the same customs, he could put Jesus' teaching in context for us. And that's so key to the study of the scriptures. You see, we tend to miss a lot of the meaning in Jesus' parables and teachings because we tend to look at them through the eyes of 21st century Western eyes. But Bailey helps us look at them through the eyes of the kind of Middle Eastern peasant that Jesus was speaking to. All right. In this parable, we should be asking ourselves three questions. Here they are. What is the main point of the parable? What does it tell us about God? Another author, Lloyd Ogilvie, refers to the parables as the autobiography of God being written through the Son. Of course, Emmanuel, God with us. They reveal who God is and also what we're meant to be. And then the third question we need to ask is, if I believe this truth that Jesus is teaching, then what do I do with it? So be thinking of those three things as we go through Luke 15, where we find this parable of the prodigal son, but we're going to call it the story of the prodigal father. As we said, prodigal means giving something on a lavish scale. And as we'll see, the Father's love knows no limits, his forgiveness knows no boundaries, and his joy knows no restraint. It's prodigal, it's extravagant, it's lavish, some might even say reckless. All right, now there are three characters in this story. We'll look at each one in depth, but the father's going to be the central character. The spotlight is never off him, and he dominates every scene, even when he's off stage. And of course, we have the two sons, who are the supporting characters. But before we do that, let's take a quick look at the setting of this story. Why Jesus is telling it. Again, we said Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem for the final time, knowing he's going there to die, knowing who's going to put him to death. And at the start of this chapter, Luke 15, the scribes are heard grumbling. They're grumbling. This man receives and even eats sinners. Doesn't eat sinners. That'd be bad. This man receives and even eats. Let's try it one more time. This man receives sinners and even eats with them. All right. We talked about this last week. And we said there were two things that just seemed so bad in their eyes about doing that. It was bad enough to receive them. Sinners were considered unclean, so that meant Jesus accepted the unclean. But then to actually eat with sinners? Oh my goodness. Because remember we said to eat with a person in the Middle East shows total acceptance. Well, this parable is Jesus' answer to the attitude of those grumbling Pharisees. He wanted to show his real purpose, which was not to cater to the religious leaders. It's like Jesus told the religious leaders when they got angry at him for eating at a tax collector's house over in Mark chapter 2. He said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." You see, God's way is not to turn away from the sinner. Now, God hates sin, but as this parable demonstrates, he never stops loving us. God's way is to rejoice when even one sinner comes to repentance, turns around from going the wrong way, comes back to him. And this parable illustrates that. All right, let's start off with the younger son. Take a look at him. Verses 11 and 12. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." And so he divided his property between them. Now, to our ears, that might not sound so bad. But you see, in Jesus' time, this request meant one thing. The younger son is not willing to wait until his father passes away to get his inheritance. Basically, it's the same as saying to his father, "I wish you were dead already." And this outlandish request, it means he wants his father to die. Ken Bailey once asked some peasant tribesmen that he studied if this would ever happen, and where the father would give him that after that request. And the tribesman said, no, the father would beat him. The father was expected to discipline the boy for making such a cruel implication. But this father is different. As Bailey explains, he acts in a way like no father in the past or today. These are divine actions. Now, of course, we realize that the younger son, he represents us, doesn't he? Yeah. He represents our rebellion against God. It's been said that mankind really longs for the death of God. I'm sure you've heard the famous quote by the now dead atheist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who claimed God is dead. And in April 1966, Time magazine published a very controversial cover that asked, "Is God dead?" And I've always loved the answer that came from an old Pogo comic strip. God is not dead. He is merely unemployed. Well, the problem was that the younger son, he was driven by selfishness, self-pride, selfishness. He puts himself and his own pleasures first. Now, technically, he hasn't broken any laws. Deuteronomy 21:17 says he was entitled to 1/3 of the property, and the father could choose to divide his property and give him the legal right of possession, even though it's very costly to him to do that, and of course it breaks his heart. But of course, the younger son, he isn't thinking of anyone else. He just doesn't care about others in the family clan and how they'll suffer. Because think about it, suddenly 1/3 of their total assets are gone. And in order to raise the cash to give the son, they had to sell some property or some houses. They had to do that quickly, probably at cheap prices, and even worse, maybe to Gentiles. And notice this. Notice how the son demands his share of the property, not his inheritance, because that came with some responsibilities, which he didn't want. In fact, according to Bailey, when the younger son separates from his dad, he cuts himself off from his real inheritance. He cuts himself off from the security of the family, as well as the security of the whole village that would have looked out for him. The village, that was their social security, their health insurance, the assurance of marriage, and physical and emotional well-being. Everything was centered around the village and the family. And likewise, when we cut ourselves off from God, we are totally on our own. Well, like I said, it breaks the father's heart, but rather than force his son to stay and deepen his hostility, the father gives him his share of the property, and then he heads off. Let's keep reading. Verse 13. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and then squandered his wealth. Or as the Passion version puts it, he soon wasted all he was given in a binge of extravagant and reckless living. And then, after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country. Now, that phrase there, hired out or joined together, some versions say, it meant he went up to some farmer and he just glued himself to him. He hung on for dear life. You can picture him hanging on to the guy's leg, saying, "You got to help me." So in order to get rid of this pest, the farmer gives him the nastiest job he could think of, which was feeding pigs, which of course would be especially offensive to a Jew. Now, have you ever visited a pig farm? A few years ago, we got to take a group of kids to visit a modern pig farm, which is pretty sanitary, pretty nice. But I can remember my grandmother lived on Punxsutawney, and across the street from her was a farmer who had a small pigsty. And we got invited to go in and view it, and could barely breathe in there. It was horrible. It was horrible. Well, things just keep getting worse for the son. Verse 16 tells us the son was so famished, he was even willing to eat the slop given to the pigs because no one would feed him a thing. Back in the 1800s, there was a severe famine in that same region, and we have this description. Men were venturing out at night unarmed, were attacked and eaten. Straying animals were killed and eaten raw. Shoe leather, rotten flesh, and garbage were all devoured. They even ate palm trees. Families in the village, seeing death upon them, would brick up the doors of their house and await death in an inner room to keep their bodies from being devoured by hyenas. Well, as horrible as that was, the younger son would endure almost anything rather than give up his pride and return to his father. But finally, we have this significant phrase. But when he came to himself, in other words, when he wised up, when he got hungry enough, he decides to go back to his father's farm. Now, it's important to realize here that he isn't exactly going home. No, he's going to a farm where he knows he can get a job. There's still no sign of repentance here. He's just kind of working a plan. He's total despair, but he hasn't repented yet. Now, despair often is the first step that brings some folks back to God. But we also have to understand that this is not an easy decision for the son to go back. Going back to the village after what he had done to his family was going to have some dire consequences. They are so upset at him. He knows he will face great shame and humiliation. He's going to have to face that nasty older brother, and then he's going to have to face the angry village and their cruel insults. They despise him for what he's done. In fact, what they will do is they're going to make him run a gauntlet. The villagers will line up in two lines. He's going to have to run between them while they kick at him and hit him with sticks and spit on him and call him all sorts of names. But he heads back there. He doesn't have much choice, does he? And like we said, at first, he's not going to say he's sorry. He has this face-saving plan. He'll get to eat, but what he's going to do, he's going to work as a servant to pay for it. Let's read verses 17 through 20. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am, starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father." So you see, in a real sense, he hasn't really started home. He's still in a far country, at least spiritually. And I don't know, maybe he's not willing to try and repair that broken relationship, or maybe just assumes it's impossible at this point. But things do not work out the way he planned. What does happen is totally unexpected. And that's the most amazing part of this story. Right? Let's look at what the father does. The village knows that this boy is in disgrace. Everyone expects the father to remain aloof while the boy makes his way through the village. It's the expected thing to ignore the boy as he makes his way home. And first the son will be obliged to sit for some time outside the gate while one of the servants asks if the father will let him in. And after a long time, he will be allowed in order to be punished. That's the way that the father could preserve his honor and dignity and do that by disciplining his wayward child. But what happens next is totally unexpected. Now, it's interesting. Some have argued that in this parable of Jesus, there's no cross. There's no act of redemption in this parable. No evidence of sacrifice. In fact, for centuries, Muslims have called attention to the Father's forgiveness in this parable, and they question the need for a mediator between humanity and God for a cross. That's why this book's called The Cross and the Prodigal, to show where the cross is. But they'll say, where is the cross in the story? Well, it's here. It's here. You just need to recognize what it cost the Father to welcome his wayward child home. All right, let's take another good look at verse 20. From a long distance away, the Father saw his lost son. Now, right there you have a picture that the Father's going each day to the path leading up to his house, looking down, stretching his eyes, hoping that his son is going to be coming home. From a long distance away, this father saw his lost son, dressed like a beggar, coming down the road. And great compassion swelled up in his heart for his son who was returning home. As the Philip version says, his heart went out to him. Well, what does that mean? How does this reveal the terrible shame that Christ endured on the cross? Well, here's what you got to understand. You see, in that culture, a man of the Father's age, a man of position, always walked in a slow, dignified fashion. But what does this father do? This father races out to welcome his son. In fact, the Greek word here is a technical term used for the foot races in the stadium. And then, now, have you ever tried to run in a robe? What you have to do is you have to gather it up. You have to gather it. When he does that, when he gathers it up so he can run as fast as he can, his undergarments are showing. It would be like running down Davis Avenue in your underwear. And to a Middle Easterner, this is all terribly shameful. Now, the father is hoping that the angry gang in the street will be so distracted by this outrageous sight that they'll forget about tormenting his son. Instead, they'll run after the father, amazed at seeing this old man shaming himself publicly. The father is willing to make a fool of himself and become the object of scorn and ridicule in order to save his son. He knew the punishment that his son would face, and because he loves him, he takes upon himself the guilt and shame that really belonged to the son. And God put himself in the same humiliating position. He took our shame. He took our place and bears our cross. Isaiah 53:6 says, all of us, like lost sheep, have gone astray. We have turned each one to his own way. But the Lord has caused the wickedness of us all, our sin, our injustice, our wrongdoing. He's caused the wickedness of us all to fall on him instead of us. As one commentary says, a respectable, upstanding, and influential Jewish father simply didn't make a habit of doing something like that. Middle Eastern scholars note that running and throwing their arms around and showering a child with kisses, that was understood to be a mother's job. Dads aren't usually big huggers, are they? Well, at least not my family. My dad always would give us a good firm handshake. Well, usually. I remember that one time walking to school, and he's walking to catch the Pat bus into town, and for some reason, as we're walking down the street, he decides to put his arm around my shoulder and walk down the street with his arm around my shoulder. And I'm dying, I'm a high school teenager, and I'm thinking, oh, my friends are going to be walking along here any minute. Of course, you'd love to have that happen now, right? Well, notice that the son doesn't deliver the full speech that he had prepared. Verse 21, the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. He doesn't offer to become a servant. He's so overwhelmed by his father's action, he can only put himself completely at the mercy of his father and say, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And he realizes his son. There's the repentance now and his need to come back to his father. He surrenders to his father's will. Well, the father is overjoyed to have his child back. Verse 22, the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe. That was the one reserved for a special guest. And put it on him. Put a ring on his finger. That's a symbol of trust. And sandals on his feet. You see, slaves went barefoot. And so the shoes showed that he was accepted back as a son. For all you Harry Potter fans, it's kind of like when Dobby gets the sock. Dobby is free. Then he says, bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead, and he's alive again. He was lost, and now he's found. And so they began to celebrate. Now that fatted calf shows two important things. First of all, this party was being given for the whole village. You served chicken for 2 to 4 people. You served ducks for 5 to 8. A goat for 10 to 15. Sheep for 15 to 35. But a fatted calf, that's for the whole village. And it was to show that he was part of the village again. And of course, the blood of the calf represents a covenant, a new relationship. Now, it seems like this story has a happy ending, right? But don't forget, there's still one relationship that's still broken, still needs to be fixed. So we're going to have to look at what's going on with that older son. Verse 25 through 28. Meanwhile, the older son was out in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come home, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has come back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. So he knows his brother's return. In fact, heck, the whole village knows by sundown. But he refuses to do the job that an older son would be expected to do, and that's to be the mediator. Normally, that would be his job. But you see, things are not as they should be between the older son and his younger brother, or between the older son and the father, because it's a terrible insult to his father to refuse to go to the party. In fact, the custom then was for the father to sit with the guests, and the oldest son is expected to stand and serve through the meal as sort of a head waiter. And in effect, this tells the guests, you are so great and so important that even my sons are your servants. Well, it would have been bad enough to have to wait on the guests, but serve his lousy little brother? No way he was going to be able to handle that. But the thing that really ticks him off is that the younger brother had been accepted back without paying a penalty. And this kind of still happens today, doesn't it? When a big-time senator becomes a Christian, a celebrity, an athlete or something, and they're often accepted in every segment of the community except the righteous. They'll say, oh, what's that person doing here in church? Or what's she doing here? Now, at the very least, male members of the family had to come out and shake hands. Again, if not, this is a personal insult. But the oldest son doesn't go. He intentionally disses his dad by remaining out in the field. And it's important to realize that this rebellion is every bit as serious as what the younger son did. Well, word of his refusal reaches his father, spreads to the guests at the party. They're scandalized, and they're tense, and they're waiting to see what the father will do. They expect the older son will be punished immediately, or maybe at least ignored until the guests have gone home, and then beaten properly. But for the second time, the father responds with incredible love, and he demonstrates a willingness to endure shame once again in order to reconcile with his child. So here in the courtyard, the father stands pleading with the older son, and that's where the older son shows his true colors. Verses 29 through 30. So his father went out and pleaded with him, but he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him. Well, the father reminds him of what he has done for him. Verses 30 and 31. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found. Okay, now we have our happy ending, right? Actually, we have no ending. You see, this parable is incomplete. Jesus kind of leaves it in midair. And he does this on purpose. But why? Well, keep in mind who he was talking to, who he's addressing. He's addressing a group of religious sinners who will eventually be responsible for his cross. They hated the younger son, those sinners that Jesus accepted. They are the elder sons. And Jesus is telling them that there is still the chance to rejoice with the Father at the younger son's return. Or, in the hardness of their hearts, they can choose to reject his love and increase his suffering. In other words, Jesus left it up to them to finish the story. But you know, history tells us how it actually ends. Based on actual events, the end of the story would be something like this. Then the older son, in great anger, took a large wooden stick and beat his loving father to death. That's what happened when men rejected Jesus and his love and nailed him to the cross. See, the younger son left of his own will. He made the decision to sin. The older son refused to let go of his pride and self-righteousness, and he just kind of drifted away slowly. And we need to ask ourselves, does either one of those describe us? We might be like the younger son who purposely chooses to turn our back on the Father, to disrespect him, to be more concerned about our own desires and pleasures, and purposely be doing something we know is wrong. Or maybe we're drifting away slowly. We're more concerned about ourselves than others. We aren't willing to forgive others the way the Father forgives us. We don't have the Father's heart. And yet, he still loves us. He still loves us with that prodigal love. All right, before we finish, let's go back to those 3 questions that we need to ask of any parable. What is the main point of it? Well, it's that God offers unconditional love. There were 2 kinds of sinners, 2 lost sons, but the forgiveness of the cross is offered to all. And it's up to us to accept it and then choose to return that love. What does it teach us about God? Well, it shows us his prodigal love, his compassion, his forgiveness, and his self-sacrifice. He is our prodigal Father. And question number 3, if you believe what Jesus is teaching here, what should you do? Well, just like Jesus, I'm going to leave it in midair. I'll leave the answer to that question up to you. God has done everything he can to show his prodigal love. Now it's up to us to respond.